Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode. Today, we're talking about biblical reasons for remarriage after divorce, and I'm using ideas from John MacArthur and Wayne Grudem. I'm doing this video in response to a video that I did previously that did very well, and one of the brothers that watched it put a comment saying that he agreed with the points that I made, but did not understand the biblical reasons for remarriage. He could see divorce permitted in the scriptures that I showed, but he could not see that remarriage was permitted. And so I'm doing this particular scripture to answer this particular video to answer that question. And the point I'm going to be making is essentially that Jesus permitted divorce and remarriage in one case, which was due to adultery, and we see that in Matthew 19:3-9 and Matthew 5:32. Okay, but we're going to focus on just Matthew 19:9 right here and talk about it briefly. I want to try to keep this video short. It has the potential to go long. So here we see Matthew 19:9. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another, commits adultery. I encourage you to go and read the context, what comes before and what comes after this text. It's very, very important in understanding what I'm about to say, and I'm not going to go into reading it right now. But Jesus here responds to a question that he has been asked, and this is a conclusion that he gets to. The question he has been asked in the context is whether it is biblical, it is lawful according to the law, God's law, to divorce one's wife for whatever reason. So that's straight to say that some people who have looked at this passage and have said that when Jesus talks about permitting divorce here and remarriage, he's talking about situations that have to do with engagements. That's not true, because that violates the context and the content of this passage. So again, the passage, we start looking at the passage here, we see that Jesus says whoever divorces his wife. The big part to note here is except for sexual immorality. And then another part to note here is and marries another, commits adultery. This exception clause here is very important. If Jesus had said that whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality commits adultery, that would have been a different story. If he had left out marriage here, that would have been something very different. It would have been hard to do in the context, but it would be a different scripture. He adds it there, and that means something. Okay, if he had left it out, you would see that the scripture will read, and I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality commits adultery. But how do you commit adultery when you simply divorce your wife? That's impossible. Adultery is sleeping with somebody else when you're married. You cannot commit adultery by simply divorcing your wife. But if you commit adultery and remarry somebody else, and you did, and let me rephrase it. If you divorce your wife and you marry someone else, when God does not recognize that divorce, it means God sees you still as married to the person you wrongly divorced. In which case, if you marry someone else thinking that it's a new marriage, God does not see that as a new marriage. And so when you're sleeping with this new person, God is there saying you're committing adultery. You're committing adultery because your real wife in his eyes is the one that you divorced, the first one. Now, this passage makes sense if you put and marries otherwise there's no, if you take it out, if you take and marries another, then it doesn't make any sense. So this passage must necessarily have and marries, and that's here in the content And you also cannot live out except for sexual immorality. Here, you cannot live that out, obviously, because Jesus here includes it. Okay, that's an important part. Something that is very important to note, even before I go much further, some notes that I jot here, and I'm going to come back to expounding on this passage a little bit more. And what I'm doing here is the same way that John MacArthur and Wayne Grudem see this passage, and I'm convinced is the right way to see this passage also. Okay, divorce isn't God's ideal. God hates divorce. That's something that we should always remember. No matter the reason for the divorce, God hates it from the beginning to the end. God hates divorce, has always hated divorce from the beginning. He made them male and female, and he wanted them a man to leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two become one flesh, and they are no longer two but one flesh. And what God has joined together, no man should separate. No man should put asunder. That's how always been God's will, and still is. Now, the second point I jotted here, which is important to note, is that God never commands or requires divorce no matter the reason. That's also important. However, you need to think about this third point. Because of the fall and sin in the world, God allows divorce in a few situations to protect the victim and regulate the industry, if you want to call it that way, the idea of divorce. Okay, so God knows that because sin entered into the world, God's perfect ideal recorded in the book of Genesis, a man leaving his mother and father and joining his wife, the two becoming one flesh, that was God's idea before sin entered into the world. It has not changed God's vision or God's idea, but sin has entered into the world and has corrupted everything to the point where God says in his word that every inclination of the heart of man is towards sin, that all people everywhere have become sinners, that it has made it to the point where God realizes that divorce is going to happen, whether he likes it or not. It's going to happen. It happens. And God steps in to regulate it. When you go and look at Deuteronomy 24, which is a passage that the Pharisees were talking about, who asked Jesus the question that led to this declaration here, you would see that that's what was, they had that in mind. And God, in that passage that they misinterpreted, God was essentially limiting divorce and not requiring it or commanding it as the Pharisees thought he was doing. So that's really important. And something you note here is that Jesus does something radical here. Jesus essentially tells those people that the only grounds for divorce that he allows, that the law allows, is for sexual immorality. Now, why is that radical? Well, at the time of Jesus, there were many Jewish sects and many teachers that were interpreting the Old Testament law, and they were saying that you could divorce your wife for any cause. That's why if you read the context above and you see what the Pharisees asked him, they asked him, can you divorce your wife for any cause, for any reason? Those teachers were teaching that if your wife made you a bad meal, you could divorce your wife. If you saw another woman who was prettier than your wife, you could divorce your wife. You could divorce your wife for any reason. You just have to give them a certificate of divorce. That's it. Jesus took all their million reasons to divorce your wife and he chopped everything to one. And the one is not a command still. The one is a permission. I allow you to divorce in this one case. Even though when you read the whole counsel of God, even in that situation, it is not God's desire that people would divorce. If it is possible, as long as it is possible with the person that is being hurt, if you can reconcile with your husband, if you can forgive like God has forgiven us, that is the best thing to do. But God allows, he permits, he does not encourage. If you were to forgive your husband and get him to get therapy, or forgive your wife and get her to get therapy in a situation where one person was cheating, and you can get your spouse to be loyal again and you could forgive them and build a better marriage, you're going to earn more points before God than if you divorce your wife or your husband. God is going to cheer for you and honor you more. Okay, notice something here that I note here, that when Jesus says whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery, he implies the converse. Divorce and remarriage on the ground of sexual immorality are not prohibited and do not constitute divorce. That's very clear from the logic of the passage. Something that's also important to note here for people who think that somehow this passage does not permit remarriage is that everywhere in the Bible, in the Old Testament and the New Testament, when divorce is mentioned, the idea of remarriage is assumed. This is the view also, again, of John MacArthur, and I agree with that, and Wayne Grudem. I looked at the passages in the Old Testament personally. I went and dug them and looked them up, and looked at the passage in the New Testament. Every time that it is mentioned that divorce is spoken of, remarriage is spoken in the same context. Okay, something that is also very important, even outside the Bible. In the both the Old and outside both the Old and the New Testament, in the first century Roman world in which Jesus was teaching, divorce was always paired with the right for the person that divorced to remarry. There was just not the thought that a person could legally divorce and not remarry. So when Jesus is talking about that in his context here, it's very clear that he knows the people that are in front of him know that when you divorce, you are expected to remarry. And so he does not deny all remarriage. He only denies remarriage for everything that is not from sexual immorality. That is important. So the take-home point here, and there's a lot more to be talked about. There are other passages that we can look at. There's Luke talks about it, and Mark talks about it, and Matthew 5:32 is another passage that also talks about it. But if you read all of this in context, you come out with the fact that remarriage is permitted. Remarriage is permitted in the case of divorce that results from sexual immorality. The person who is permitted to marry and will not be a sin before God that they marry is a person who was wronged. And again, the person who was wrong in this case is encouraged to do everything possible to work with your local church to be able to get the help you need, and also to see if it is possible to be able to reconcile with your spouse first. And if that is utterly useless and not possible because this person continues to live in sin and continues to do sexual immorality and has moved on, possibly even remarried, and no hope is left, then you could move forward and remarry and be 100% sure that God will bless your marriage and will bless you because you are getting married on grounds that He permits and allows. Well, that's it for this video. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below. If you've not liked the video, please like and share. I love to create these videos, and I love your support to share this with many people so they can benefit. If you have any questions, I'd love to help you. If you have questions in faith or in medicine, I'd love to be able to help you. Again, this is Dr. Acha. I'll see you in the next video.